Well, good morning. It's great to see you all this morning. Welcome back to Fifi Baptist Church. I hope you had a nice week this week. My name is Matt, if we hadn't had a chance to meet today, and I'm one of the interim pastors here at Fifi, along with Pastor Daryl, who is holding down the fort in the foyer area this morning. Well, today we are continuing our Life and Teachings of Jesus series that we kicked off several weeks ago leading up to Advent, or as part of Advent, leading up to Christmas Sunday. And we're walking through some selected stories throughout Jesus' life, looking at some of the things he did, some of the things he taught, in hopes of this being a way for us to get to know him some more. Now today, as you see on the screen, we are skipping some material in the life of Jesus. Last week, if you were here, we were in Matthew chapter 11 and chapter 12, where Jesus told us that his yoke is easy and his burden is light, and then he showed us what this looks like by showing mercy on the Sabbath. And then, as you might recall, at the end of the story in Matthew chapter 12, after Jesus healed this man with the withered hand in the synagogue on the Sabbath, the religious leaders got pretty angry and they started devising a way to conspire against Jesus. They wanted to figure out a way to destroy him and the message that he was all about. Now, that was in Matthew chapter 12. And my goal in this series is to get to the cross and the resurrection by Easter Sunday, which if you haven't looked at your calendar lately, it's coming up fast on March 31st, so sign up for that breakfast. It's coming up quick, and that means we have to skip over a lot of stuff if we're going to get Jesus on the cross and out of the grave by Easter Sunday. So reluctantly, therefore, we're going to have to skip a fair bit today. So if you have your Bibles, as you see, we'll be in Matthew chapter 21, and a lot has happened between Matthew chapter 12 and Matthew chapter 21. If you were just to fly through that, you see that Jesus casts out lots of demons. He heals more people, tells several parables, feeds 5,000 people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. He walks on water, as Pastor Daryl preached on a few weeks ago. He feeds 4,000 people with 7 loaves and 7 loaves of bread and a few fish. He was transfigured in front of his disciples, and there's more. So we're skipping a lot, with my apologies. And all of this happened, everything I just mentioned, everything we've seen so far, all of this has happened outside of Jerusalem, the big city. Now today in Matthew chapter 21, we're going to see Jesus' first appearance in the main city of Jerusalem. And we're also going to see the first thing he does once he gets there. Now admittedly, the material we're covering today would be better for Palm Sunday. Palm Sunday is coming up on March 24th. But there's a lot that happens in that last week leading up to the crucifixion. And I wanted to give us a little bit of time to look at some of that stuff too. So we're going to cover a traditional Palm Sunday material today, even though it's not Palm Sunday. So with all this said, let's go ahead and look at Matthew chapter 21. And we'll start in verses 1 through 3. It reads, "When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, 'Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this, the Lord needs them, and he will send them immediately.'" Now, a couple of things to notice here in these first few verses. First, does it strike you as strange that the disciples can just roll up on a couple of animals, untie the animals, and then simply tell the owner, dude, the Lord needs them, and get away with it? I just think that's weird. This donkey and this colt are presumably pretty valuable to the owner. He presumably uses them for stuff, right? Plowing fields or hauling a wagon or something. I don't know. I'm not a farmer. But the owner is supposedly cool with these 2 dudes rolling up, taking their animals, and they're just saying, yeah, the Lord needs them. Says who the Lord needs them? Put yourself in the owner's shoes. Imagine you walk out of church this morning and you get into the parking lot and you see a couple of dudes messing around with your car. They're jimmying open the door, they're getting ready to hotwire the ignition, they're going to drive off with your car, and you go up and say, "Hey fellas, it's probably an honest mistake, but I think you got the wrong car. That's the car I drive." And they're like, "No, dude, yeah, the Lord needs it." What would you say? Well, probably something like, if you're in a good mood, "Well, I'm not so sure the Lord does actually say that. That's my car. Maybe we can call the police, see if they're hearing from the Lord the same way you are." But this is what Jesus tells his disciples to do. Roll up on a couple of animals, take the animals, and if anyone says anything, just says, "The Lord needs them." And that's exactly what they do. Now, in Matthew's account, the owner doesn't say anything. But in Mark and in Luke, sure enough, somebody says, hey, what's going on? They tell them the Lord needs it, and they're okay with that. I just think that's interesting. I would love to meet these people, the owner of the animals. I just think that'd be fascinating. You know, there's a lot of people I look forward to meeting in heaven one day, and these guys are on the list. Now, of course, there's a lot of people I'd want to meet first, probably. Like, obviously, Jesus is at the top of my list. I'm excited to see my grandma again. I'd love to meet my other grandma who I never got a chance to meet. Dude, it's going to be a blast to meet the disciples, to meet Paul, some of the church fathers, my Anabaptist heroes, Charles Spurgeon, Billy Graham. That's going to be so fun. But I'm also looking forward to meeting these guys, these unnamed owners of these animals. These people that someone came up, said, I'm going to take your donkey and your colt because the Lord needs them, and they're okay with that. Like these people, the owner of this animal must have a level of faith, or at least naivete, that is beyond me. Like, why did they trust the disciples taking these animals? Were these people already following Jesus, and that's why they took it? Or had they at least met Jesus before, maybe on a holiday up in Galilee? Had they even heard of Jesus before? What did they think when the disciples said, the Lord needs it? I find it interesting. I admire these guys, these unnamed people, because they're showing me what faith looks like, right? The Lord calls, the Lord needs it, and they answered. It's a faith, a blind faith that says, if the Lord's involved, I trust him. Let's let the Lord do it. Now, a second thing to notice here is something kind of unique to Matthew. Now, in Mark and in Luke, the disciples find a colt who had never been ridden before. So if you read Mark's account, if you read Luke's account, you have a colt never ridden before. In Matthew, though, the disciples grab a colt and a donkey. Now, this is easy to miss, perhaps because we're more used to Mark's account and to Luke's account, but Matthew is very clear. It's a colt and a donkey. Look again at what Jesus says in verse 2. He says, go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. Now, in Matthew, this is not an insignificant detail as far as Matthew is concerned. Now, as you might have guessed by now, we've done a lot of Matthew through this series. Matthew loves to connect things Jesus says and does to the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. And this is precisely that. The fact you have a donkey and a colt, Matthew connects to fulfillment of the Old Testament. Look at verses 4 through 5. It reads, this took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. There was the Old Testament prophecy thing saying. Verse 5, tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So you have both here, the donkey and the colt. And this prophecy comes from Zechariah 9, verse 9. And if you read through this section of Zechariah, this in Zechariah 9 is about a coming king who's going to come and liberate Israel from its enemies. This is a triumphal king, but what Zechariah says surprises everybody. This conquering king who's going to liberate Israel from their enemies is not riding through on a massive chariot. He doesn't have like a big team of bodyguards around him. This coming king, as we saw here, will be humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I think the point here is that God is full of surprises. I think that's by design. The reformer Martin Luther says that God hides the truth like this sometimes as a way to teach us to trust God without relying on empirical data. Look, if your conquering king is riding through town on a donkey, you have very little reason to trust that this is the military hero you need in the moment. If you're looking for a military hero, you're not looking for a dude on a donkey. You're looking for a dude that's like strong, riding in on a chariot. He's got a shield. He's got a spear in hand. He's a tough man. He's going to beat up your enemies. Surely this is the kind of guy who would wipe out Israel's enemies that are named in Zechariah 9. Places like Aram and Tyre, Sidon, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Philistia. You need a dude like that. But that's not what you get in Zechariah. Zechariah's king doesn't show up with a military entourage. He shows up on a donkey. All of the empirical data, all of the evidence from the outside looking in says the guy on the donkey is the wrong guy. Go find a stronger guy with a better military, but the truth is hidden. The man on the donkey is indeed the conquering king. And Martin Luther says that God hides himself like this because our fundamental problem as humans is that we trust other things other than we trust God. In particular for Luther, we trust ourselves more than we trust God. We trust what we can see. Look, Luther would have had a field day with the state of Missouri, right? We're called the show me state. Luther would not live here probably. Now we need to learn to trust despite what we're seeing. And the guy riding the donkey in Zechariah is indeed none other than the King of Kings coming into Jerusalem. So this then is what faith looks like. It's kind of like what we saw with the unnamed owner or owners of the donkey and the colt. They trusted the disciples. They said the Lord needs them. Okay, cool. That's what faith looks like. Faith looks like letting God be God, trusting what you can't see. It's putting your trust in something that you have no proof for. You know, it's like you're walking out on a plank and you don't realize it, but the plank you're walking on is actually a bridge. That's what faith looks like. And this is what we see here in the triumphal entry in Matthew chapter 21. This traveling teacher from Nazareth riding into Jerusalem on a donkey may not look like it. All of the evidence says it's not, but the truth is, with the eyes of faith, we see that this man on a donkey is the Messiah King that Israel has been hoping for since at least Zechariah 9, verse 9. And so the disciples, they go and get a donkey and a colt, just like Jesus said. Now back in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 21, look at verses 6 and 7. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. I think this is really interesting. You see verse 7, he puts the cloaks on them and sits on them. A couple weeks ago, I was joking with my students in Greek about this verse here in verse 7. So he gets a donkey and a colt and he rides on them. So how would this work? You know, it's kind of weird. Like it says Jesus is riding them. Now, I know Jesus can walk on water. Yeah, Pastor Darrell established that for us. But how do you ride two animals at the same time? Like walking on water, okay, cool. Now you're riding on two donkeys at once? So, you know, in my Greek class, we did some brainstorming, and then I decided to do what a lot of students are doing these days. So I turned to AI, artificial intelligence, and I asked the AI machine to draw me a picture of Jesus riding two donkeys at the same time. And it spit out several options for me, so I'll kind of show you what AI came up with. The first one, maybe he rode on top of two of them at once, but like on some sort of like box thing. So yeah, maybe like, you know, they're kind of walking in unison. Maybe Jesus had to grow an extra leg. This next one, see there, he's got an extra right leg. Maybe that's how he did it. It's kind of weird. The right leg is red like the other side. It should have been blue, you know, whatever. Maybe as a two-headed donkey, something like that. I really like the next one. Maybe he put the little donkey on top of the bigger donkey and sat on that one. You have, Tyler, who's overseeing our youth ministry, he's in my Greek class, and Tyler suggests it's more of a Dixie Stampede kind of thing. So kind of like that. I suggest he's probably close, but it's probably more like water skiing, kind of like this next one. All right, take that down. You're freaking me out. So AI isn't helping us much. But I'm not going to lie, I did have a lot of fun making those. I had so much fun. I showed my office mate at work. I texted Andrea, my wife. I was like, dude, look at these. Then I asked, is it too sacrilegious for church? They're like, just try it and see what happens. So in truth, though, it probably wasn't like any of these. In truth, what probably happened, if you were there watching it live, Jesus is probably riding the colt, the unridden one, the younger donkey, like Mark and Luke says, riding that one. And the donkey, who's probably the colt's mother, probably went along with them, probably walking alongside of them. Now, this would fulfill the prophecy, like Matthew said. You're riding on a colt and a donkey. But it probably served a very practical purpose, too, because if this colt had never been ridden before, like Mark and Luke says, this colt probably benefited from having Mama walk with it, so it kind of keeps it cool while everyone are shouting and screaming and waving palm branches in the air. So I think that's probably what happened, but AI is still kind of fun. But anyway, back to the main point. So Jesus is riding a colt and a donkey, however he did this, to fulfill the prophecy from Zechariah 9, verse 9, quoted in Matthew 21, verse 5, "Tell the daughter of Zion, Look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." And then Jesus finally enters Jerusalem in verse 8. "A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road." Now, the crowd in the Gospels has been a problem before. We've talked about this. You might remember a couple of weeks ago where the crowd is pressing in on Jesus when he's trying to go and heal the daughter of Jairus, and the woman with the medical issue comes through the crowd and all the rest. The crowd's an issue sometimes in the Gospels, but this time the crowd's doing the right thing. This time the crowd is praising Jesus for who he actually is. Jesus is riding a donkey, which to most of us may not look like the Messiah king, but perhaps the crowd had Zechariah chapter 9 in the back of their minds, just like Matthew did. They see Jesus riding in on a donkey, and they recognize Jesus for who he is. They recognize this man on the donkey as the coming king himself. And so they take off their cloaks, they lay their cloaks on the road, which if you read in 2 Kings chapter 9, that's exactly what they did for King Jehu. It's a common practice. You put your cloaks on the road for a coming king. And then look what they say in verse 9. "The crowds that went out ahead of him and that followed were shouting, 'Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven.'" You see how that's kind of offset. That's going to become important here in a second. So the crowd calls Jesus the Son of David. That's king language, right? They're hailing the coming king who's coming in the name of the Lord. And then they chant, as you see here, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." And that's a quote from Psalm 118, verse 26. Now, Psalm 118 is too long for us to read this morning, but if you were to look at that, you'd see that Psalm 118 is a song that the people would chant at Passover, is one of the Passover songs. And in this song, they're praising God for the ways that he has shown his enduring, steadfast love. The psalm remembers ways that God has delivered Israel before, the way that God has stepped in and rescued Israel. And then they are begging God to do that once again. A lot of the psalms are like that. Remember, God, when you did this? Now, God, we need you to do that again. That's what Psalm 118 is like. Remember all the things you've done. Now we need rescue once more. We see this in Psalm 118, verse 25. It says, "Save us, we beseech you, O Lord. O Lord, we beseech you, give us success." Now, this is a fitting request for Israel in Jesus' day, of course, right? They're under Roman control. They feel like they've never left exile from Babylon. They leave Babylon, then it's the Greeks, then it's the Romans. They feel like they just can't, be an independent people again. So every Passover, they pray again and again, Psalm 118, "Save us, we beseech you, O Lord." Then the next verse, Psalm 118, verse 26, this is what the crowds are chanting to Jesus when he rides into Jerusalem. "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. We bless you from the house of the Lord." And then curiously enough, the next verse mentions branches in Psalm 118. I just think that's interesting. Look at verse 27, Psalm 118. "The Lord is God, and he has given us light. Bind the festal procession with branches up to the horns of the altar." So they're all waving palm branches, and what do we have in the psalm? Binding this procession with branches. I just think that's interesting. And then Psalm 118 finishes by thanking God for his steadfast love, because he is indeed the God who delivers. And so back here in Matthew 21, when the crowds are crying out, "Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, Hosanna in the highest," what they're doing is repeating a psalm that they sing every year at Passover. And it's a psalm that thanks God for the ways he's delivered them and begging God to do it again. So to be clear then, as Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, this is not just some strange sideshow. This isn't like a party trick. Every part of what we're seeing here is on purpose. Every single bit of this, from the donkey to the cloaks on the ground, to the branches, to the words that the crowd are shouting, all of this points to the deep reality of what is happening before our eyes. Israel's Messiah King is here. Now this leads to some confusion, because this is not what you expect a Messiah King to look like, riding in on a donkey. And so we see that confusion in the next two verses. Matthew 21, 10 through 11. "When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, saying, 'Who is this?' The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." So the Messiah King Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee, he's here in Jerusalem. And then look at what he does next, Matthew 21, verse 12. Then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seat of those who sold doves. Now, this feels a little bit dramatic, doesn't it? The Messiah King, he enters Jerusalem. He doesn't do anything else. He goes straight to the temple. Then he starts showing everybody what's up. He goes in and starts driving out those who are buying and selling in the temple. He overturns the tables of the money changers, overturns the seats of those who are selling doves. What's this all about? Now, the way the temple is designed, there's certain parts of the temple that, different types of people can go into. There's one part anybody can go into. There's another part only Jews can go into. It's kind of fun. When I was in Istanbul, they have the plaque, like the stone, the inscription that was on that part of the temple in Jerusalem. And it says in Greek, if you go past this, you will die. So it's pretty serious. Like if you're a Gentile and you go past this, you're inviting death on yourself, is what it says. Only Jews can go to that part. There's another part that only is for the priests and so on. And Jesus is likely in that main area where everybody can go to. So it's the outer court. Now, in the outer court of the temple, where anybody, Jew, Gentile alike, can go, this is where you'd find the money changers. And the money changers fulfilled a really important purpose. So if you can kind of put yourself back in the ancient world, people from all over the Roman Empire are coming to the temple in Jerusalem, particularly at Passover. So if you're coming from all over, you're bringing various stuff, various coins, various money from all over the Roman Empire. And the money changer's job, much like a foreign currency exchange at an airport today, was to take all of this foreign currency and convert this into coins that could be used in the temple. Now, here's the significance of that. Now, much like our money today has like people's faces on them. People in the ancient world, their monies had people's faces on them. And if you're looking at Roman money, the faces are the faces of the Caesars. And in the eyes of many Jews, this was an idol. Because you have the face of a dude, and not just any dude, but like the Caesar. It's like having a coin with Nebuchadnezzar's face in your pocket. So they view these as idols. And many Jews were uncomfortable with bringing a coin like that into the temple because it's like bringing an idol into the temple. So what you do is you go to these money changers, you'd exchange the idolatrous coin with Caesar's face on it for a coin that's good to use in the temple, which usually just had like some grain or like geometric shapes or something like that on it. And that's what you would then use in the temple. So people would use these temple-approved coins, and then they'd go into the temple, and that's where you would buy an animal for your sacrifice. So they wouldn't bring an animal necessarily. They'd go into the temple and purchase one. Now, to be sure, there's a convenience factor here, no doubt, right? Particularly at Passover, you have people coming from all over the place. And it's a major hassle to bring your sacrifice, bring your lamb with you, or bring your doves in some sort of cage with you. So you would just go to the temple and buy the stuff there at the temple. Now, we don't yet know why Jesus overturns the tables and the dove sellers, but the next verse gives us a hint. Look at Matthew 21, verse 13. He said to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer,' but you are making it a den of robbers." So this phrase here, this is a quote from Jeremiah 7, verse 11. And we'll talk about the significance of that here in a second. But Jesus' complaint right here is that they're turning God's house into which is supposed to be a house of prayer, into a den of robbers. Now, what does that mean? How are they doing this? How are they making the temple a den of robbers? Well, I think there's two potential reasons, and I think both reasons are probably right, actually. I think they're turning the temple into a den of robbers, first by robbing God, and second, perhaps, by robbing the poor. So we'll start with the first one. How are they robbing God? Well, remember what I said a moment ago. They would go to the temple and then they would buy their sacrifice there at the temple rather than bringing a sacrifice from home. Now, I think the issue with this, is that it cuts the heart out of the sacrificial system. If you think about the book of Leviticus, right? In Leviticus, it says you're supposed to pick an animal that is without spot or blemish. So you want to pick out the animal that is not the sickly one. You don't want to pick out the mangy looking one, the ugly one. You pick out the best looking animal. You'd pick out the strongest animal. You'd pick out the cutest animal, if you will. Now, they don't have like massive like agricultural farms like we have now where you have like thousands of sheep or thousands of cows. Most people just have a few animals. And several weeks ago during Advent, we saw how a lot of people live with their animals. So if you can think, you have a lamb. Lambs are cute anyway, but you have to pick the cutest lamb. You live with this lamb. Your kids probably snuggle this lamb. They play with this lamb. And you got to pick out the cutest looking animal, and then you got to go kill that one. You got to kill your kid's favorite pet every year. It's dramatic. That's that feeling, that's what sacrifice is supposed to do to you. It's not a financial exchange. It's supposed to hit you right in the heart. It's supposed to say, wow, my sin has ramifications. My sin made me kill my kid's favorite pet. So you can see then, as you go into the temple, if you're just buying the animal, it's very sad, sure, because they're probably pretty cute too, but you haven't developed that relationship with it like you would if you're living with an animal. And I think that what Jesus is saying here by robbing God is you're cutting the sacrifice part out of the sacrifice. It just becomes a financial exchange. You're just paying money, and that's not quite the same. So I think that's what he means by a den of robbers. I think it's kind of a way of robbing God. If you remember from a few weeks ago, we talked about how Jesus says if you're going to follow him, you need to count the cost. You're following Jesus is not about finding the most convenient route. And I think they're robbing God in that respect. Second, there's a hint here that they might be robbing the poor. Now, Matthew is clear that Jesus overturns the seats of those who are selling doves. Doves or pigeons in the Old Testament were sacrifices that poor people could make. So if you didn't have enough money to sacrifice a lamb, or if you didn't own any lambs, you could sacrifice a dove or a pigeon. Now, Matthew doesn't tell us this, so I'm kind of reading into it a little bit here. But it's possible that the guys in the temple are selling these doves to poor people, but they're charging way too much money for it. Now, it's kind of like I imagine, like at the airport, right? You're not allowed to bring water past the security. You get into the terminal, and the bottle of water is like $7. I was like, come on, man. You won't let me bring it in. Now you're going to take off my arm just to drink a thing of water. I think that might be, again, I'm reading into it. We don't know for sure. But I think that might be what is happening here. Perhaps they're selling the doves for way too much money and really robbing the poor, perhaps. Again, we're not sure. Now, for however this is going down, whatever Jesus means by robbing God or making it a den of robbers, Jesus is convinced that they've taken God's house and they've turned it into a place of robbery. As I mentioned earlier, this is from Jeremiah 7, verse 11. And if you read Jeremiah chapter 7, this chapter is God telling the people that they've turned the temple into a den of robbers. And so in Jeremiah 7, God says, because of this, I'm going to destroy the temple. I'm going to send some people in and they're going to wipe out the temple. So this is probably what Jesus is saying too. Jesus is probably warning them that God is going to come and destroy this temple. Now, he flat out says that in other places. In John chapter 2, for example, he says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll rebuild it. People get mad about that. Matthew chapter 24, the disciples and Jesus are talking, and Jesus is like, yeah, dude, this temple is going to be destroyed. And so he says it point blank in other places. But I think what he's doing here a bit more prophetically is saying that this temple is going to be destroyed. Now, if you go into the temple, you start tearing stuff up, you start knocking things over, you start talking about how the temple is going to be destroyed, that's the kind of stuff that gets you killed in Israel. And in Mark and in Luke, the chief priests and the scribes, because of this, start plotting to kill Jesus. Now, in Matthew's version, it's going to come a little bit later. They start plotting at the end of chapter 21, as Jesus tells a few parables that are really laying into the religious leaders. They're kind of fun, kind of really letting them have it. And then they decide they want to kill him. So it's a little bit, just a little bit of a delay in Matthew. But clearly the religious leaders aren't too happy with Jesus for what he's doing here in the temple. Now, what happens in verse 14 probably didn't help out either. Looking at verse 14, the blind and the lame come to him in the temple, and he cured them. Now, Matthew's gospel is the only one who tells us that the blind and lame are in the temple coming in. But it fits Matthew's gospel pretty well. Some Jewish traditions thought that it was against God's law to bring blind and lame people into the temple because they're not whole, so they don't belong in the temple. But Jesus is clearly totally cool with that. And this fits what we've seen elsewhere in Matthew's gospel, where remember, Jesus says that God values mercy over sacrifice, quoting from Hosea. It gets even worse for the religious leaders in verse 15. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the amazing things that he did and heard the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became angry. Dude, now even the kids are calling Jesus the Son of David. Now even the kids are calling Jesus a king. You know, if this gets down all the way to the children, you know that this has worn itself out. Like my kindergartner, like he says the word yeet. Like Gen Z was saying that like 3 years ago. Once the kindergartners are saying yeet, you know this meme has reached its way all across the culture. And now if the kids are calling Jesus Son of God, you know there's a whole lot of other people who are calling that too, because kids are probably hearing this from somebody. So they're running their mouths calling Jesus the Son of God, the Son of David. And the chief priests and the scribes, they've had enough. They're mad about it. So they turned to Jesus in verse 16 and said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read? Out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise for yourself." Now this is a bold thing for Jesus to say to them. Why is it bold? He's quoting from Psalm chapter 8, verse 2. And if you read Psalm 8, it's a praise to God himself. Look at how the psalm opens, verses 1 and 2. Psalm 8, "O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens." Now it's what Jesus said, "Out of the mouths of babes and infants, you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger." So Psalm 8 is a song that's praising God, and Jesus just applies this psalm to himself. So Jesus is telling the chief priests and the scribes, basically, yeah, the kids are praising me because I'm God, and you need to deal with that. So yeah, things are escalating very quickly. Now I'm really tempted to finish the rest of the story. There's so much more we could talk about this last week leading up to the crucifixion, but alas, it's 11:27. We do need to stop for today. And we've covered a lot. So let's wrap up by looking back at Matthew chapter 21, verse 10 again. "When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, saying, 'Who is this? Who is this?'" This is the question that each one of us in this room, each person you know and I know, need to answer. Who is this? Who is this Jesus of Nazareth riding into Jerusalem on a donkey? Our story today gave us 3 answers. Number 1, who is this? Jesus is the prophet. As the crowd say in chapter 21, verse 11, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. And Jesus isn't just any prophet. He's unlike any prophet who has walked the earth before, because other prophets speak for God. Jesus is God himself speaking. So when Jesus talks, that's God talking. So he's not just any prophet, he is the prophet. Number 2, we learn from the blind and the lame that Jesus is the compassionate healer. Verse 14, the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them. Friends, Jesus can breathe new life into whatever situation you're facing today. And third and finally, we learn from the kids that Jesus is the Son of David. Verse 15, Hosanna to the Son of David. Jesus is the King. So the people of Jerusalem asked in Matthew 21, verse 10, who is this? The crowds, the blind and the lame, and the children give us the answer. Jesus is the prophet of God, a compassionate healer, the King of Kings. So who is this? Well, now we know. And friends, today is the perfect day for you to get to know Jesus better too. Our triumphal King is here for you this morning. So please don't leave today without knowing for sure that he's your King too.